Is the Russian economy about to collapse? So it has been almost 18 months into the conflict and a lot of things have happened. The G7 has slapped a record amount of sanctions on the country, bringing the total count well above 14,000. Then we have an admission from Putin that the Kremlin paid the Wagner Group $1 billion in 2022, and that is a lot of money. The Russian economy did contract by 2.1% in 2022, but it's much less than expected. And the big question here is if Russia can continue to fight on, or if the country is truly going bankrupt. Because if Putin runs out of money, then the conflict will come to an end. At least that's the hope of the West. However, if the Russian economy is resilient enough, this conflict will drag out and a long war could even favor Putin. But before we come to a conclusion, we need to know that Russia has shifted gears from a civilian economy to a wartime economy, and this means money and funds are being concentrated on supporting the war effort. So the conversation here today is if Russia can keep fighting without going broke. It's not about if GDP can return to pre-war levels, because that would be near impossible with all the sanctions in place. We also need to analyze if Russia's reserves can sustain their expenditure or not. And this is important because the longer Russia can fight on, the more the West could double down and spend as well. And this means an environment of perpetual inflation and high interest rates. We'll be in a world of endless deficit spending, not just by the Russians, but by the Western economies as well. And so far, the West has spent nearly $150 billion in support to Ukraine, and the majority is coming from the United States and the EU. But it doesn't seem to be working. Russia still holds at least 17% of Ukrainian territory. That's 10% more grounds before the conflict. So how long more can this situation last? And unless things escalate from conventional to nuclear, this war will largely be a battle of attrition, especially on the financial side. And let's start with the inflation numbers in Russia. Inflation is a very important metric because it affects the cost of living in Russia for the local people. In 2022, the world suffered from an insane inflation crisis. Protests over food and fuel surged last year across Europe because the cost of living was out of control. There were 42 recorded demonstrations in 2022 that revolve around inflation, and that's the highest recorded in the past 5 years. Russia is not immune to this dynamic. If inflation becomes too high for too long, people will start to protest and could force Putin to the negotiating table. Now, Russia's inflation in 2022 was extremely high. It reached a high of 17.5% in April before coming down to 11.3% in February this year. Now, high inflation rate is nothing new for Russia. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, inflation rose well above 15%, so this isn't the first inflation shock they had. And interestingly enough, inflation has dropped all the way down to 2.5% in May, showing that higher prices are actually stabilizing. And if Putin can keep the rate of inflation stable, this minimizes the odds for revolt by the Russian people. And to keep inflation in check, the Bank of Russia has set interest rates at 7.5%. That is well above the current inflation rate of 2.5%. And this encourages the consumer to save money instead of spending, helping to keep a lid on inflation. And according to baseline estimates, Russia believes their annual inflation will average 5.5% in 2023 before normalizing down to 4% in 2024 and beyond. Now, there are some upside risks as Russia is suffering from significant labor shortages that could drive inflation higher. But how bad is Russia's inflation situation compared to the West? And this is a useful comparison because it's a battle of who is hurting the most. If we compare the inflation rates of the United States, the Eurozone, and Russia, we get quite an interesting result. Between the three, Russia's inflation is actually the lowest at 2.5%, America is at 4%, while the EU stands at 6.1%. So while Russia suffered horribly in 2022, prices are starting to stabilize. But in the West, the cost of living is still increasing. So this is a toss-up between Russia and the G7. Overall price increase in the West is less than in Russia for sure, but the Russian central bank can react much faster than the Federal Reserve or the ECB. Because Russia isn't that heavily leveraged, they can hike it as high as they want without immediately collapsing the economy. But in the West, it's quite a different story. We have seen the fall of 3 banks in the United States thanks to high interest rates. So America and the EU will have to keep tiptoeing around rate hikes. Russia doesn't have that problem. And unless an extreme event happens, Russia's inflation won't take down Putin anytime soon. What about the Russian ruble? Will its collapse spell the end of the war? After the Wagner mutiny, the dollar surged by almost 10% against the ruble. In addition, there was a sudden rush to a US dollar stablecoin on the day of the mutiny itself. $15 million worth of rubles was sold to buy USDT. Now, weaker ruble is important because it means Russia's imports will get more expensive. The majority of exports in the world, they're all priced in US dollars. So collapsing ruble to the dollar will cause inflation to go up. That's true. But Russia's been taking steps to de-dollarize, not just in their central bank reserves, but in terms of transactions as well. And we can see that since February this year, the US dollar has lost its position as the most traded currency in Russia. And this tells us that Russia has been trading less in dollars and stepping up its use of the Chinese yuan. In a report from Reuters, vast China-Russia resources trade shifts to yuan from dollars in Ukraine fallout. And listen to this, China has been dramatically increased use of the yuan to buy Russian commodities over the past year, with nearly all of its purchases of oil, coal, and some metals from its neighbor now settled in the Chinese currency. And we're talking about $88 billion worth of commodity trade. So instead of receiving dollars, Russia's now getting the Chinese yuan for their oil, gas, and metals. So how does this help Russia? Well, the Chinese yuan is more stable than the Russian ruble versus the dollar. And we can see that year to date, the yuan has lost 5% against the dollar, while the ruble has crashed by 17%. So by conducting more trade in yuan, Russia is helping to preserve the purchasing power of their oil sales. And remember that Russia is facing a ton of dollar sanctions, so it doesn't make sense for them to transact in the reserve currency. And what Russia has been doing in the meantime is to sell the yuan to help prop up the ruble, so the fall of the ruble can be stemmed to a certain degree. But a big shout out to our sponsor today, Private Internet Access. We all know the importance of keeping some money outside of the banking system, especially in gold. We want privacy for our wealth, and you should be treating your data the same way. Now, using the internet without PIA is like holding your wallet in your back pocket. All it takes is one fast tip to kiss all your money goodbye. Now, online browsing isn't as safe as it used to be. You don't want your identity stolen and any of your financial accounts compromised. And this is why having a VPN is just so useful. It hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. And that keeps your data activity confidential away from the hackers. Now, PIA is completely easy to use. You can download the app to your phone or to your desktop and get started. In fact, you can use it to protect all your devices. There's no limit to the number of devices you can use it on. And it works for all platforms including Windows, macOS, and Android. Now, PIA servers covers over 83 countries, including each and every US state. And if I am accessing my trading accounts, I want to make sure my details are completely private. Now, best of all, PIA is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support is there to help you. You can get started with private internet access today and get an 83% discount using the link in the description below. Plus, you'll also enjoy 4 months for free just for being an awesome subscriber to the channel. So check them out and get protected today. But what about the ruble to the Chinese yuan? If trade with China is increasing, a depreciating ruble to the yuan would be disastrous. It would mean Russia could import fewer Chinese goods using their local currency. If we look at the ruble versus the yuan, it is still above pre-war levels. The fall isn't as severe as compared to the dollar or the euro, so imports from China are massively compromised. As the Federal Reserve continues to hike interest rates, the Chinese yuan is likely to fall further versus the dollar. So if the ruble falls and the yuan falls together, their exchange rate will somewhat stabilize more with each other. And if there's one thing that determines the fate of Russia's economy, it will have to be the deficit. When you have one, it means your economy is losing money. Deficits are very simple to explain. It basically means more expenses than revenues. The bigger the deficit, the more money Russia is losing over time, and the deeper they have to tap into their reserves. And according to Russia's finance ministry, their federal budget revenues from oil and gas have dropped almost 36% in May from a year ago. And this is to be expected because of a falling oil price. Brent crude was only around $110 in May 2022 compared to only $75 today. That's a 40% drop in the oil price. Plus, the sanctions have forced Russia to sell oil at a discount to China and India, so revenues have indeed fallen. And so far, Russia has experienced a $45 billion budget deficit in the first 4 months of 2023. That is 17% more than expected. In May, Russia's revenues actually increased, resulting in a budget surplus, breaking down the deficit to $42 billion. But this deficit situation is expected to continue as oil prices continue to drop as the world moves towards recession. The war is also escalating, so war spending from Russia is also going to increase. And the big question now is if Putin can sustain these deficits. Does Russia have enough reserves to sustain the burn? And unlike the United States, Putin can't print money without serious consequences. He can't just conjure up rubles from thin air without creating a currency crisis and a massive inflation. And this applies to every country except America. And to plug this hole, Russia has to use their international reserves. And last month, Russia announced they were selling 75 billion rubles worth of foreign currency to plug the hole. But how much damage has it caused? Is Russia going to deplete their war chest anytime soon? And this is where things get really interesting. In May, Russia had around $600 billion worth of reserves. That is $30 billion less than the start of 2022. But if we zoom out, we can see Russia's forex reserves hasn't really changed much over the past 2 years. It has always been around $600 billion. So Russia isn't in danger of going broke anytime soon. And within Russia itself, they have a reserve fund that is made up of gold and yuan. It's called the National Welfare Fund. And most of it is liquid and can be drained to sustain the war effort if needed. But what do we see? Since January this year, the reserves has actually increased from 10.4 trillion rubles to 12.4 trillion rubles. Russia's reserves have actually increased. And how is this even possible? Well, it's because Russia is raising money by selling ruble-denominated bonds to their domestic market. And so far, they have raised 1 trillion rubles worth to keep the spending up. Mostly Russian banks are buying, but still keeping the economy afloat without depleting the reserves. It's basically deficit spending the same way the US runs the economy. So this state of affairs can continue for quite a long time because Russia can still raise money internally and their reserves are extremely vast. And let's say Russian bonds go unsold and their deficit remains constant at a high of $10 billion a month. It will take 60 months for the reserves to completely deplete and for Russia to be in real trouble. And that means at least 5 more years of war. And it's quite a stretch because you are assuming the price of oil doesn't recover for the next 5 years. And once again, the question is how long Russia can keep up their war spending. We want to know just how long this war can drag out, at least on the economic front. And it can be anywhere from 5 years to indefinite, and it all depends on Russia's revenues. Now, one big factor that drives Russian revenues is China and India. And since the start of the sanctions, these two countries make up the bulk of Russia's oil sales. They have been feasting on cheap Russian oil for more than a year now. And if we track where Russian crude oil lands up, nearly 12 million tons were absorbed by India and China in May. China bought 5 million tons of oil, while India bought nearly 7 million tons. And these two countries make up the bulk of Russian oil purchases. In fact, Russia's oil sales are now back to pre-war levels. So if the West really wants to bankrupt Putin, they have to stop China and India from buying Russian oil. But this is where we need to combine geopolitics together with economics. Neither China nor India wants to see Russia's economy collapse because they might be next if Western sanctions fully work. If Russia's economy is crushed by the oil price caps and dollar sanctions, that would mean it's an effective strategy to use in the future. And many countries in the global south might not want to see Russia win, but they also don't want to see them fail. And we know Xi and Putin have a no-limits partnership, so China's support for Russian oil won't waver. But what about India? Will they stop buying Russian oil? Now, if we look at Russia's Asian customers, we can see no other country buys as much oil as India. In May, India was buying a record 2 million barrels a day, which is driving enormous amounts of money for Russia. In fact, Russia is now India's top oil supplier, outstripping Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iraq. But here's the reality, India is going to keep buying cheap Russian oil because it benefits them. India's Foreign Minister Jai Shankar has said time and time again that India won't choose between the United States and Russia. So oil revenues from India is going to flow. It's not going to stop. But could this change? Sure it could. Nothing is set in stone. There are now opposition groups that want to ban US imports of refined Russian oil. Human rights groups and Ukraine wants the US to stop buying refined Russian oil from countries like India. They want to close the loophole to squeeze Russian revenues further. But if this happens, the world will be thrown into another inflation hell, not just for the US, but for emerging economies as well. And this will just divide the world further. So it's really unlikely that either China or India will stop supporting Russian oil. The US and the EU also understands there are limits to sanctions. You can't just overplay your hand to the max. So on the economic front, this is a battle of financial attrition. The West wants to drain away Russia's reserves, while Putin, he is betting that inflation will keep interest rates high in the West and plunge them into recession. Germany and the EU have already slipped into a recession. Economies are also expecting the UK to enter one as well by the end of the year. Inflation isn't coming down, and the Bank of England has to hike rates even further. This could push the British economy off a cliff, and in the US economy, things are looking quite bad as well. So far, it has been resilient, but calls for contraction in 2023 are getting louder and louder. We have HSBC calling for America to enter recession this year, and according to the bank, the US will enter a downturn in the fourth quarter, followed by a year of contraction. And this is bad news for the war effort. If a recession happens, it will be harder to justify sending more money to fight the Russians. Support is already starting to waver. In a study by the Pew Research Center, more than 40% of Republicans say that the US is spending too much aid to Ukraine. And if public support starts to wane and the economy is front and center, Russia might actually be able to outlast the West. According to the survey, fewer Americans say Russia's invasion is a major threat today than in March 2022. And we can see a big drop in sentiment across both the Democrats and the Republicans. It has crashed from 50% to just 32% overall in slightly over a year. So it's very important to realize that 2024 elections could change everything. If Biden loses and the US economy enters a recession, support from America could actually slow down or even stop. In contrast, if oil prices continues to collapse and Russian deficits keeps piling up, that also could shorten the war. Putin will be too broke to fight. But if we just base the estimates on the status quo, Russia can still keep the fight going on for many, many years. And remember, we aren't factoring in any escalations from either side. Things could very well go nuclear, or the US can ignore inflation and keep printing money to fund Ukraine. Sure, the chances of those happening are rather low, but it is not impossible. So we have to prepare for an environment of higher inflation and higher interest rates. We are not going back to a peaceful world anytime soon. But let me know what you think in the comments below, guys. Is Russia's economy really collapsing, or will the fighting continue for years on end? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.